Hello, the purpose of this class is to give you some tips about how to writing papers. And then I'm going to use my previous presentation as a guideline. So first, you need to come up with a good title. And usually the title has to be around 12 words or less. You cannot have a too long title. Well, depends on what journal you're submitting. So let me present you my earlier paper. So the presentation I presented last class, the title have around 12 words. So let me explain how I come up with the title. So first, I know that there are three key features about my paper. So supplier encroachment, capacity constraint, information asymmetry. So therefore, I just come up with a title, a capacitor supplier encroaches on a less informed buyer. So this one basically capture all the important thing concerning about this paper. Then I have some word left, like I have 2 or 3 word left. So I have to think, what should I do to include the other 2 or 3 words? So one of the important results of my paper is that information is bad for you. So if you're the supplier, you have additional information that actually is negative. So I thought that this is an interesting result. So therefore, I want to somehow capture this idea into the paper, the title. So what I used is information liability. So liability is something that talks about the negative. So usually when we think about information, that will be positive, but then information liability, that means it's negative. So therefore, the title itself actually reveals one of the results. So if you are a reader, you look at this paper, you look at information liability, then you want to ask, well, what kind of liability are you referring to? So that is how I come up with the title. So then the next thing, which is the keyword. Usually the keyword are 3 to 5, around 3 to 5 keywords. So once again, in my paper, so then there are 3 key features concerning about my paper. The first thing is supply encroachment. The second thing is limited capacity, and the third thing is asymmetric information. So I want to have a little bit, like I have 3 keywords, so I can have 1 or 2 more. So I'm thinking, what should I do? So I want to make sure that this paper would be sent to a reviewer that understands game theory. So in game theory, there is a keyword, a jargon called signaling. So basically, if you are someone that's studying game theory, and if you see the word signaling, then you know that this has something to do with a branch of literature in game theory that is called signaling game. And then I have one more keyword that I'm thinking. Well, this paper is about capacity. So capacity is a very important thing. And then withholding is a terminology in capacity constraint. So that talks about that you buy more than you need. Okay, last time I gave an illustration that let's say the customer only require 100 from the buyer, but then the supplier have 101. So therefore the buyer would buy 101 but only sell 100. That means it withhold 1. So that is a withholding keyword. So if you are a researcher that has studied about game theory and capacity constraint, if you look at withholding, then you have a good idea about what I am trying to do. So then the third important thing of a paper is the abstract. So there are multiple ways to write an abstract. So one way that I find very useful is to separate the abstract into 5 different sections. So problem definition. So what is the problem? Business problem. Okay, academic practical relevancy. That means what other people have done in the literature. The third one is methodology. Are you doing a mathematical model? Are you conducting a survey? Are you doing data collection? Are you doing experiment? So what kind of technique or method do you use to carry out this research? The fourth one is results. So what kind of theoretical results that you have that is interesting? And the last one is managerial implication. So if you are a manager, what would you do? So the first one, problem definition, and the last one, managerial implication, are written for the manager. So that means you need to write it such that someone with no background in research, they are simply manager in real life. If they look at the problem definition, they know what you are doing. If they look at the managerial implication, they know what they should do tomorrow in their work. Academic practical relevancy, methodology, and results are written to professor, are written to researcher. So therefore, you can be a little bit more technical in that sense. So specifically for academic practical relevancy, you want to point out why do you need to do this research? So what is the difference between what has been done and why is that important? For the results, which is from that difference, what is the result that you can generate? So let me illustrate how I do it with my paper. Okay, so I'm going to give you some time to read my abstract. So an abstract is usually around 200 to 250 words. So some journal have a word limit of 100, but some other journal have a word limit of 300. So it really depends. So let me try to explain what I have done. So problem definition is written to the manager. So the manager needs to understand the rough idea that you're trying to do. So once again, my paper have 3 different features. The first one is supplier encroachment. Okay, so supply encroachment. So this is the first 2 sentences. I try to bring out the idea that the companies, they are competitor, but they are also cooperative. So that brings out the concept of co-opetition. And specifically within the co-opetition, this one concerning about supply encroachment. The second feature of our paper is on capacity constraint. So therefore, this talks about capacity constraint. So how can you divide between the buyer and supplier? So if you're a manager, you look at this, you would have a rough idea that, okay, so now it may be Apple, Samsung, they are a supplier, they're supplier, and they are also competitor. So then Samsung have a capacity constraint. So therefore, like this one would immediately reveal some big idea, the problem. The second one is what is your contribution to the literature from a theoretical perspective. So remember that my paper had 3 different features. The third feature is asymmetrical information. So there are other papers that have done the first 2 features, which is supply encroachment and also capacity constraint. But then those papers do not consider asymmetrical information. So therefore here I highlight that from a theoretical contribution perspective, our paper contribute to asymmetrical information. And then for the method, so I use a game theory model. So therefore, I have a word signaling game. So if you are an editor, you look at the paper and then you look at the term signaling game. So you know that when you are finding a reviewer to review for the paper, you need to find a reviewer that have understanding about game theory, not about empirical data, not about experiment. So that is very important because sometimes if you use one particular methodology, but then someone with other methodology background become your reviewer, then there may have some confusion and would not be able to provide the best judgment. So that's why I want to have the word signaling game up front. So like not only in the keyword, but also in the abstract. So that help the editor to find the right reviewer. And then the rest is basically have a rough idea about what the math model is going to be. So basically, if you are a researcher that have done game theory, signaling game, then by looking at this paragraph, the methodology paragraph, you would have a very good idea about what I'm trying to do. Okay? And then the fourth one is the theoretical results. So you want to highlight the results that is interesting, not doing something that is not interesting or what you have done. Okay? What does it mean? So for example, if in the results you says that we derived the optimal solution, we have conducted sensitivity analysis. So those are what you have done, but those are not results. So you need to highlight what is the result. So what is a good result? So a bad result, that means if you have more information, it's good for you. If you have less information, bad for you. Or if you have more capacity, good for you, but if you have less capacity, bad for you. So those are obvious results. You do not need to go through the mathematical model to have those results. So those are very obvious. You want to highlight result that is not obvious. So for example, my paper find that if you have more information, bad. If you have less information, good. If you have more capacity, bad. If you have less capacity, good. So then the reader reading these results, then the reader would be really intrigued or really curious about why you have such kind of interesting results. And then the last one is managerial implication. So basically, you can imagine now if you are the CEO of Samsung, you read this paper, what you should do tomorrow. That is the mentality when you're writing this. So then if the Samsung CEO reading my paper, then my paper demonstrates that the supplier should find ways to disclose its capacity information credibly by using EDI. So therefore, there is some actionable item or something that is written to the business world that they can do. So as I mentioned earlier, the first paragraph, which is problem definition, okay, here the problem definition, and the last paragraph, managerial implication. So those are written to real-world practitioners. They should be able to understand what you do without going to the math. And then for the academic relevancy. So this is written for a researcher. So a researcher needs to know what new knowledge have you contributed. And then for the methodology, so the methodology is written such that someone with a similar background, let's say someone have background in game theory on signaling game, that person should understand very well what you are trying to do simply by reading the methodology. And then for the result, that is once again for the researcher. And you need to write the result that is interesting, not the boring result, not the intuitive result, and not what you have done, but the interesting results. So my abstract have, let me see how many words. So my abstract have around 269 words. Okay, so usually when someone read your paper, so the first thing they read is the title. And then the second thing they read is the keyword. By reading these two, they would have a good idea what you want to do. And then the third thing they read would be the abstract. By reading the abstract, then that person have made up their mind about whether they like your paper or they dislike your paper. So for myself, 50% of the time, after reading the title, keyword, and abstract, I have made up my mind. And the time that I read the introduction, I'll read the math model, read the results like in the paper, basically I am just finding reason to reject the paper or finding the reason to ask the paper. So that's why I want to highlight that having a good title, good keyword, and good abstract is extremely important. Okay, that for a person reading your paper, they may take 1 minute or 2 minutes to read the abstract, but then the first impression really matters. So the next thing I like to highlight is how to write an introduction. Okay, so let me go through the introduction really quickly and then explain the detail. Okay, my introduction starts at the end of page 1 and then it goes to here to around page 5. Okay, so let me show you in a big picture format. So here is the abstract and then page 1 at the end. So then one page is the introduction, second page, third page, and then it's stopped around here. So around 4 or 4.5 page. So let me take a big picture perspective about what is the introduction. So then I like to separate the introduction to 2 halves. So 1.5 page, so here, so page 3 in the middle. So that is the middle point. So before the page 3, that is the story. What is the motivation? After page 3, so then I have 1.5 page to talk about the results. Okay, so let's zoom in again. So let me provide you more information. So the first paragraph of the motivation. I'll give you 1 minute to read this. So this is the first paragraph, and the first paragraph is very important for people to understand what you're trying to do. So I use a very famous example. So everyone knows what is Apple and what is Samsung. So therefore, that is very good as an introduction example. And this example captures the 3 features. Remember, there are 3 features that I have in the paper, which is supply encroachment, capacity constraint, and also asymmetrical information. So to bring up the supply encroachment, so I use the first 3 sentences. supply encroachment with the same example, then I do this. So basically with the capacity constraint, and the remaining, which is something about asymmetrical information. So I acknowledge that I don't have a very strong asymmetrical information motivation, but then otherwise, this is a nice example that captures pretty much everything that I want to say. So when you try to decide a paper, so you want to have a very good example as well. What is not good? Not good. That means you have three different features: supply encroachment, capacity, and also asymmetrical information. So if you have one example on supply encroachment, a different example on capacity, and a third example on information asymmetry, that is not good. You want to have one comprehensive example that consists of everything. So this is the first paragraph. So that would let the reader know what we have, what my paper, what is the setting of my paper. Then I provide the second paragraph, provide several additional examples. Okay, so here provide several additional examples concerning my paper. So the motivation is that I have more than one example. So what is a good number of examples? Usually if you have 3 examples, that is good. 3 or 4 examples is good. 5 examples is too much. So when you do an example, try to make sure that you have 3 to 4 examples where one of them is more famous. And then the next paragraph, I presented what is the trade-off. The trade-off, that means what is the good thing and what is the bad thing that we're trying to study. So to know the trade-off, that means it's not always one-sided. So sometimes this can be good, but sometimes the other thing can be good. So the answer is not obvious. That's why we need to study this problem. So that would be the third paragraph. And then now we are at the middle point of page 3. And the page 3 trying to describe what I am doing in this research. So here I provide a big summary, a big mathematical model that what I'm trying to do. So the writing of this one is actually very similar to here. So the third part of the abstract. So there is a lot of overlap between this abstract part and also what I want to do here. Okay, and then I have 2, 3, or 4 research questions. 2, 3, or 4 research questions. So when you do research, so in the beginning, you may have some research question in mind, but then after you do the problem, then you may find out that those research question does not give you a good answer. So you have to find out what place you have good answer, and then reverse engineering and find out what should be a good research questions. And then the remaining 1 page here, the remaining 1 page is trying to explain what are the answer to the research question. So here, everything is the answer to the research question, and that's it. So basically, let me present you the big picture again. So the first half page, or about like 75% of the page, is on the abstract. And then page 2 basically is about the story. So you have to present sufficient stories such that people are convinced that what you are doing has real life relevancy. And then like around page 3, then I present the research questions and also what is the setting of my research problem. And then on page 4, And a little bit about page 5. So literature review actually stopped in midway of page 5. So little bit of page 5 talks about what is the main finding of my paper. So that is how you write the introduction. And then when you're writing the literature review, so let me get back to this, okay? So we just talked about the introduction having one comprehensive story, which is the Apple story, Apple Samsung story. And that needs to have 3 or 4 good examples, which is what I talked about earlier. And then briefly states the method. In my case, is a math model, and then highlight the most important results. And then for the literature, so then depends on what you are trying to do. For my type of research, so I consider 3 different features, and then which is supply encroachment, capacity constraint, and also limited asymmetrical information. So that my paper is the intersection of these 3 literature streams. So if you are doing something similar, then basically your paper relates to 3 literature streams as well. So I would recommend you to find 3 or 4 papers from better or equals journal that is published within the last 5 to 10 years. So let me explain. So what does it mean by better or equal journal? So when you're trying to submit a paper, so then it depends what is the level of journal you're trying to submit. So if you're trying to submit to A journal, then that in your literature review doesn't really make sense to cite some paper from C journal. B journal may be okay, but C journal, usually the reviewer from A journal would not be paying much attention to the C journal. But then if you are submitting to a C journal, then that makes sense for you to cite A journal paper and C journal paper. Maybe D journal, but not the E journal. And then it needs to be published within last 5 to 10 years, or maybe 15 years, but not very long time. So the point is that if your literature review only consists of paper that is published 20 years ago, that means this is not a relevant topic, it's old topic. So people are interested to know what is the latest development. Also, by looking at the recent paper, those papers have actually helped you to do some literature review already. So therefore, having the recent paper, that is good. And then how many papers, then you don't need to cite like 10 papers from one stream. So 3 to 4 most relevant paper is sufficient. Rarely there is a case where 10 papers are all relevant. Usually there are 3 to 4 papers that is more relevant than the other. And then, so when after you have maybe 15 papers in the literature review, usually there are 2 or 3 papers that is most relevant to your research. So for those 2 or 3 papers, you want to state what is the difference between your research and their paper. So you need to answer 3 questions. First, what is the difference between what you are doing and what has been done? The second question is, why does this difference matter? So to publish in a business journal, this is very important. Why is this matters? So if you are in science faculty, like math or physics, so then the research is that if something has not been done, then you want to study that. Okay, if something has not been done, then you should try to study that problem. But then in business, if something has not been done, doesn't mean that worth to be done. If something has not been done, it to have real life relevancy. So therefore, the second question, why does it matter? So then to address to this, that means now someone have done something and you are doing something different. So there's a difference between what you want to do. But is that an important difference? Is there any real life justification that this is an important problem? And then the last thing, which is what is the result due to this difference? So let me give you some example. So in my presentation last time, one of the relevant paper is the paper I do with my previous PhD students. So that paper look at supply encroachment and also capacity constraint. For this paper, I look at supply encroachment, capacity constraint, and information asymmetry. So therefore, to answer the first question, what is the difference between my paper and the literature, which is information asymmetry? Why does it difference? Then you have to argue that in real life, supplier would have information about its capacity. So the buyer may not know. So buyer may have some guess, but then only the supplier have the correct answer. So therefore, that makes sense that supplier have more information about itself than the buyer. So why that is why this is different. And the last question, which is what is the result due to this difference? So then yesterday when I do a presentation, I present two graphs. One graph is full information with a superscript F. One graph is asymmetrical information with a superscript star. So the difference between those two are the difference in the results. So therefore, yesterday when I'm last time when I present a paper, I always focus on the impact of information asymmetry. For example, so one result I presented is that buyer have more information, but it's worse off. The buyer have less information, but is better off. The supplier is less likely to encroach to the market when information is asymmetry. So all those are information asymmetry contribution. The reason is that the literature have already studied the first two characteristics, which is supply encroachment and capacity constraint. So my paper only focus on limited asymmetrical information. That's why all information is focusing on, the literature review is on information asymmetry. And then the rest of the paper is on math model results and conclusion. So usually when I am reading a paper, I would first take a look at the abstract and then take a look in the introduction and the math model. So I mentioned earlier that reading the abstract, 50% of the time, I have a good idea about whether I like this paper or I dislike this paper. After the introduction and also after the math model, that basically 90% of the time I have made up the mind. And it doesn't take too long. So reading an abstract takes maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes. Reading the introduction takes maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Carefully reading the math model may take about like 10 minutes. So less than half an hour, I have a good sense about whether this paper is good or not so good. And math model is very important. So you need to present everything in a clear way. And then in terms of the result. So you need to have 3 interesting results. And those results should be different from the common sense. So for example, yesterday presentation, the 3 results are, first, supply have more information, but bad. Second important result, buy have less information, but good. The third key result is when the supply have more capacity, it would not encroach to the market, only if information is asymmetry. So those are the three results that does not really make common sense. And those are the results that you need to write in here. And then for each of the results, you need to answer three questions: what, why, and so what. So what, then that means what is the result? So let's say supplier is suffered when he has more information. Okay, so that is the what. Why? Okay, so people are really confused. Why you have more information is not good. More information should be good for you. So then why? So then the reason is that the supplier, a low type supplier, need to have an even lower wholesale price so that a high supplier does not want to follow the low supplier. So with a lower wholesale price, of course, the supplier is worse off. Okay, you would notice that I do not use math to explain. I use logic to explain this reasoning. So then after reading this reasoning, the reader should now understand why there is such kind of interesting result. And the last one is so what. So what, that means I'm a manager. I find out that more information is not good. So what should I do tomorrow? So then if you are the Samsung CEO, then tomorrow you should have an EDI system or link the information system between the buyer and the supplier, or maybe you have a press release or do something to credibly display the capacity information inside your warehouse. So those are something that is actionable that the manager can do tomorrow. And then the last one is the conclusion. So basically, this is roughly how you should write the paper. So right now, I want to give you a big project. Okay, that is the final project. So now I want you to model this supply encroachment again. Okay, using the tools I taught you last time. So the story that I want to tell, okay, the story I want to tell is that there's a manufacturer, have a supplier. And then the manufacturer work with the supplier and the supplier produce the product for the customers. But the supplier sometimes steal the design and have a copycat of the manufacturer's product. And that copycat product gets sold to the customer as well. So therefore, we have two different products, PM and PS. So let's say the production cost is 0. We have a wholesale price W. So we have a PM and PS that represent the price of the manufacturer's original product and the supplier's copycat. So that is a basic story that happens a lot of time. So what I want you to do is first to draft a mathematical model and then send that to me. After I look at your mathematical model, then I'm going to provide you with some feedback, and then later on you need to write a paper on this particular topic. So that would be the big project about this class. So as I mentioned earlier, so in the first class, so there are 3 things that I want to teach: game theory, supply chain, and how to do research. So in terms of game theory, that is a supply chain. So we mentioned about that. So at the end, I want you to learn how to write this particular paper as well. And then if we have time, I want you to see if you can learn how to do presentation using my presentation last time as a framework.